Illustrious strangers at 250. Inspectors General and the American Democratic Tradition. With a special performance by Stephen Lang, award-winning actor and APD steward. Mark Greenblatt, former federal inspector general. Lucy Lang, New York State Inspector General. Paul Lockhart, American historian and author. January 28, 2026, 6 p.m. The New York State Museum. 222, Madison Avenue, Albany, New York, 12230. Archives Partnership Trust. New York State Inspector General. New York State Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Students holding open books stand in front of stage. For New York State Parks, police walk in holding flags.
Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Baron von Steuben's pocket watch. Map of Steuben Township.
Hi, I'm Kathy Boozer. I'm the acting commissioner of the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And I'm Lucy Lang, New York State Inspector General. And we are here to celebrate the life of Baron von Steuben, the first Inspector General of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Nestled near Remsen in Oneida County, Steuben Memorial State Historic Site preserves the home and final resting place of Baron von Steuben. Our agency is proud to steward this historic landmark where visitors can experience firsthand a legacy of leadership, discipline, and service that shaped our young nation.
In 1778, the Continental Army was exhausted, disorganized, and uncertain of its future. Steuben arrived from Prussia, where he had trained under Frederick the Great, one of history's most exacting military leaders, and he joined General George Washington's then ragtag army. Under the training and guidance of Steuben, the Continental Army became coordinated, disciplined, and resilient, contributing to victories that helped lead to American independence. Steuben codified his strict rules in the Blue Book, forming the foundation of the rules that are still used by the American military today.
After the war, New York State became Steuben's adopted home, the state granted him 16,000 acres in recognition of his service. He built a modest log cabin, and though he planned a larger home and formal gardens, he died in 1794 before those plans were realized. In 1804, the land was preserved as a sacred grove, and in 1931, the Steuben Memorial State Historic Site was established, which today is managed through a partnership between New York State Parks and the National Park Service. Visitors can come and walk the land where Von lived, worked, and was leased.
Steuben's legacy of oversight extends well beyond the military, with hundreds of inspectors general now serving at the federal, state, and local levels. More than 2 centuries after Steuben left his mark on New York and the nation, New York created our own Office of the Inspector General to combat fraud and corruption. For decades now, the offices of the New York State Inspector General have exercised rigorous and independent oversight of state government.
Committed to preserving the legacy of good government, our Collections Care Center teams conserve and interpret objects related to Steuben's life and work. New York State Parks is honored to be the steward of a first edition copy of the Blue Book, von Steuben's pocket watch, and the uniform of William Norris, his aide-de-camp and successor as Inspector General.
In remembering Baron von Steuben, we recognize New York's long history of independent government oversight, a legacy that continues to guide the work of public servants today committed to a government that operates with integrity.
New York has more than 250 parks and historic sites to explore our shared history, including 44 sites directly related to the American Revolution. Join us in commemorating America's 250th anniversary.
And happy 40th anniversary, offices of the New York State Inspector General.
New York State Offices of the Inspector General, Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation.
State Museum for our celebration of America 250 and the 40th birthday of the creation of the offices of the New York State Inspector General. I'm Lucy Lang, and I am honored to serve as New York's 11th Inspector General. Thank you to our many partners in bringing this evening of oversight to life. To the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, especially the team at Peebles Island, and including the Parks Police for their beautiful color guard. To the New York State Archives and the New York State Archives Partnership Trust, to the New York State Museum, and all of the leadership and staff of those agencies whose shared commitment to New York State history and to public integrity is manifest every day, but was also exemplified by their hard work to make this evening happen. Thank you to the brilliant musicians of SUNY Albany for singing our national anthem and more to come. Welcome to the state legislators and commissioners and their staff who are with us tonight, and to all of the hardworking public servants in the room. I hope you had time or will take the time after the program to appreciate some of the remarkable Revolutionary War artifacts and state archival materials that are available for viewing outside the theater, including an original copy of Baron von Steuben's Blue Book, his pocket watch, and the original executive order establishing the New York State Offices of the Inspector General 40 years ago tomorrow. And in the spirit of resurrecting archival materials, I give you now the Steuben Serenaders.
Gerhard Augustine von Steuben burst in the USA one cold December day. 1777 was the year, and his services were badly needed here.
Baron Friedrich Wilhelm Gerhard Augustine von Steuben went down to Valley Forge, looked around and said, Herr George, seems to me your army is kaput. Everybody's marching on a different foot.
I'd like to volunteer to put some order in your ranks. And if I'm successful, Congress can appropriate some things. So Frederick Ruth Augustine von Steuben began this fearsome feat to make the army neat. Now the army's looking fine, all the time, looking fine,
He picked out 100 soldiers and instructed them in person. Drilled morning, noon, and night, drilled till they did it right. When they mastered all that they were shown, they were each assigned 100 of their own.
He spoke no English, he had trouble cussing and discussing. They never at a loss, always got his point across. Language difference seems to disappear when a man is truly honest and sincere.
His book of regulations for the order of the troops soon became a sort of Bible for the military groups. So Friedrich Gerhard Rudolf von Steuben marched on the USA.
Now the army's looking fine, all the time, looking fine. Shoes are fine, looking fine. General von Steuben was here.
Thank you so much to these musicians who embraced our vision to revive this little-known folk song by Charles Raymond Offenberg that was part of the Cinema 76 exhibit at the Continental Insurance Company Pavilion during the 1964-65 New York World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, Queens. And it was captured on a vinyl record, the cover of which is pictured here, from which we extracted the music. Thank you so much to the musicians, especially to Michael Lister, Music Program Director at the University of Albany. Thank you to the musicians. The Continental Congress issued a resolution after Valley Forge describing Inspector General Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin Louis Ferrer von Steuben as, quote, that illustrious stranger who has so generously undertaken to aid us in our struggle for liberty. You'll learn more tonight about how he aided in the revolutionary cause. But first, let us dispatch with the elephant in the room. Von Steuben, von Steuben, Steuben. We can all at least agree we're not going to use his full name. But otherwise, everything is fair game. In any event, illustrious stranger, used to refer to this under-recognized founding father, seemed an apt term for the often unknown and uncelebrated role of inspectors general, sometimes called the most important public servants you've never heard of. And it is an illumination of inspectors general and oversight that brings us here tonight. And we could have no better experts to guide our conversations than these panelists, who I invite to join me on the stage now. If you have relevant questions during the course of the conversation, please email them to questions@ig.ny.gov, and we will do our very best to incorporate them. Panelists? Paul Lockhart, a Dutchess County native, is professor of history at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, where he teaches military and European history. His 7 single-author books include Firepower, How Weapons Shaped Warfare, and Denmark, 1513 to 1660. We'll save that for another evening. The Rise and Decline of a Renaissance Monarchy, Professor Lockhart is an elected member of the Royal Society for Danish History. From 2014 to 2017, he served as Brage Golding Distinguished Professor of Research at Wright State. In 2021, he was named Ohio Distinguished Historian by the Ohio Academy of History. In 2022, he was given the Trustees Award for Faculty Excellence, the highest academic honor granted by Wright State. And most importantly for our purposes tonight, Professor Lockhart is the author of The Drill Master of Valley Forge, The Baron von Steuben, and The Making of the American Army. And he is one of the world's foremost authorities on Baron von Steuben. Welcome, Paul, and thank you for being here. Rose Gill served as commissioner of the New York City Department of Investigations, which you'll hear referred to as DOI, from 2002 through 2013. She oversaw a staff of hundreds and was the longest-serving commissioner in the department's 150-year history. DOI was a first-of-its-kind and nationally renowned agency with a network of IGs charged with investigating and referring for prosecution cases of fraud, corruption, and misconduct by city employees, contractors, and others who receive city funds or do business with New York City. Under her leadership, DOI experienced significant increases in productivity, including assets recovered for New York City, and a comprehensive corruption prevention program. Former Commissioner Gill previously served as a federal prosecutor for a decade in the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, where she also served on the executive staff. She also previously served as chair of the New York City Campaign Finance Board from 2014 to 2017, a national model for nonpartisan regulation of public financing of campaigns and for voters' assistance. Currently, Rose is principal of the Bloomberg Associates Municipal Integrity Team at Bloomberg Philanthropies, which promotes transparency and establish anti-corruption measures in cities on a pro bono basis. In fact, she's just come from doing that in Lisbon, and we could offer her no more glamorous a follow-up than to come to Albany in the heels of a snowstorm. And speaking of a snowstorm, we expect to have a third panelist who may come sweeping in at the last minute, and we will embrace him upon his arrival, and I will introduce him then. Tonight's conversation will span more than 2 centuries of American efforts to confront corruption, strengthen accountability, and build public trust. So what does independent oversight mean to you, Rose, in your own work? And why do you think it has been a persistent feature of American democracy?
Well, rooted in the history of DOI is the answer to that. Just to give you a little background about the New York City Department of Investigation, it is one of the oldest law enforcement agencies in the country. It was established in 1873 following outrageous and audacious corruption that was quite systematic in New York that involved the mayor, the Chamberlain, who was the finance commissioner, the comptroller, and the commissioner of the Department of Public Works, who was also an alderman, and he was William Boss Tweed, and he was the head of the Tammany Hall ring. And quite unmolested, they skimmed money from every contract, city contract and project that there was. And just to give a vivid example, that included skimming money from the construction of the iconic Brooklyn Bridge. And so this was the way that things were in the 1870s. A whistleblower in the comptroller's office who knew about a second set of books that the comptroller kept for the ring so that they could divide up the skim became disgruntled. He did not have unclean hands. He was angry because he expected more remuneration for his participation in the ring, didn't get it, took several pages from the books, the second set of secret books, and gave them to the New York Times. The New York Times eventually published those pages, and that is really what became the downfall of the Tammany Ring. People were outraged. And each of them was indicted, and I'll get to the results of those indictments in a bit, but it brought about action on the part of the state to establish an independent oversight body, because after all, these 4 public officials, who, by the way, were also protected by the police commissioners and some of the judges who were part of the Tammany scheme, and so they really had all of the checks and balances in their own corrupt organization. No one was checking on anybody else, and so the state, really spurred by the public outcry, formed the precursor agency to the Department of Investigation, which was the Commissioner of Accounts, and gave it resources, gave it subpoena power to take documents and testimony, and had the support of new leadership. And so, to answer your question, the hallmarks of what I think is needed by an IG, and we certainly have this in New York in the form of DOI, are statutory and practical elements of independence. At DOI, they can investigate anybody up to the top echelon, which was exactly what the people in 1870 and the state wanted to be the case in 1870, because after all, it was the top echelon of government actors back then who were corrupt. And just to set the stage, this was New York less than 10 years after the Civil War. People were weary. They were still trying to recover themselves, trying to regain their footing financially, and for them to learn through the New York Times that over $200 million of 1870 dollars had been stolen systematically was just so unacceptable that it was the crucible in which this very independent, now called DOI agency exists, has grown over the years. Its powers have been increased over the years by different charter changes and executive orders by mayors. Mayor Koch, who I knew very well, in the 1980s increased the size and the powers of DOI in a transformational way. I'll just mention briefly, each individual city agency had an inspector general in it. And then separately was the Department of Investigation. Mayor Koch, whose reputation was never at issue, nonetheless suffered a number of scandals in different agencies during his last term. And what was discovered was that the internal IGs in the departments were not part of the solution, were not effective, and in fact, they were probably part of the problem in some situations. And so with an executive order, he pulled them all out of the individual departments and put them under DOI. And so overnight, the size of DOI was doubled. I would say the power was also increased tremendously. And it was a real turbocharge for the resources and the independence of oversight in New York City.
Thank you for that. So, Paul, let's rewind 100 years prior to the founding of DOI. Take us to the Revolutionary War. Briefly, how did von Steuben come to the U.S.? What problems was he there to solve? And why did discipline and oversight matter so much at that crucial time in the war?
Well, put all that together, Steuben's appearance in the United States at the end of 1777 was almost accidental, and I say that from an inspector general's point of view, that this was a career opportunity for him. Europe had been at peace since 1763 largely. There weren't a lot of career opportunities for cashiered infantry captains as Steuben was, and so the American Revolution was a godsend to a whole generation of European career officers who now had the possibility of another war. Exactly. But by the time that Steuben responded to that, by the time he learned about it, the war had been going on for some time, and a good number of French officers had already gone over in the previous year. So by the time he knew about the war and got to Paris to meet with the American delegates in Paris, namely Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane, the flood of officers to the Continental Army, primarily from France, was already beginning to have some negative effects, certainly on American morale. American senior officers did not like the fact that they were being subordinated to foreign-born officers who did not have the same stake in the conflict that they did. So Steuben already had a couple of strikes against him by the time he got to Paris. Now I will go to detail about how the mechanics of how he actually gets there. Suffice it to say, Benjamin Franklin gets a lot of credit where he shouldn't. Benjamin Franklin actually tried to keep Steuben from coming to the United States. It was Silas Deane of Connecticut who really played a key role there. But understand, Steuben was a soldier through and through. This was the life that he knew and he loved battle in particular. He never saw himself as somebody who would be a reformer, let alone an inspector general. He saw himself as somebody whose experience entitled him to a combat command. So he's somewhat disappointed when he gets to the United States, incidentally, as a volunteer, not with a promise of a commission, not with a promise of pay. Manages to make a good number of friends in wherever he goes, in Boston and New York, and in the Continental Congress, which was then meeting in York, Pennsylvania. But the fact that the Army then encamps at Valley Forge, as it had been since December of '77, did not really need any more foreigners, certainly from the perspective of the American officers themselves. This was, kind of bad timing on Steuben's part. However, as a volunteer who agreed not to take any money unless he had proven that he had contributed something, to American independence when the war was over, he was at least tolerated. And Washington saw in him something that could be quite useful, but wasn't exactly sure what that would be. And so for the first weeks that Steuben was at Valley Forge, he was primarily poking his nose into things, just getting a sense of what was going on in the Continental Army.
What IGs do.
Exactly. But with the intent of proving himself to Washington, so eventually he become a general and lead troops in battle, which is, of course, not the fate that lay ahead of Steuben. So at that point, he's makes himself quite valuable in the late winter, early spring of 1778. And that's where where he begins to play that role as an IG. It would become formalized later on, of course. And there was a lot of work to do. The Army, while it was a veteran Army, and it had done very well, actually, at the Battle of Germantown, for example, in particular, in October of 1777, there was no system to the Army. Just about every colonel of every infantry regiment had discretion as to what drill manual they used. And there even minor differences in minor tactics, like the length of a step or the number of steps per minute, can once you start maneuvering troops in bodies larger than companies and battalions or brigades, can become really problematic. And of course, the Army did not have a system for enforcing military justice. It did not have a system for procurement. It did not have a system for accounting. Just for provisions, for ordnance, for any of the material needs of the Army. And that's ultimately, the role that Steuben would come to play.
So how did he help turn the tide at Valley Forge and beyond?
Almost entirely because Washington wanted him to. And that's, the relationship between the two men can be kind of tense at times, but Steuben owed his role in the Continental Army to Steuben. To Washington, rather. And it starts out, besides the general inspection of all sorts of things. I mean, Steuben was interested in seeing how men prepared their rations, and whether this was done in an intelligent way. How much care company level officers, captains and lieutenants, actually, how much attention they paid to the welfare of their men. And he was afraid that very often this was in fact lacking, which he thought was the British habit. That the hospitals were and provisions for the sick were being administered in an orderly way. But ultimately, the thing, of course, that makes him visible to the army, and I would make the argument, certainly by the spring of 1778, there was not a single officer in the Continental Army who was as widely known amongst the general soldiery, except for maybe Washington, as Steuben was, because he was everywhere. And his focus then becomes the tactical reform of the army. And ultimately resulting, of course, in the Blue Book. But even a year before the Blue Book, in 1778, he's coming up with a new system of tactics for infantry, at least at multiple levels, of such seemingly mundane but vital things as the length of the cadence step and the number of steps per minute. To make his first task, as he put it, was to make sure the soldiers march correctly. So this is the beginning of his careers in IG.
And so there were no formal oversight bodies in the colonies at that time. This must have seemed anathema to many of the troops he was overseeing and to the leadership. What kind of resistance did he face? And we'll talk more about the resistance that IGs, as many of the folks in the audience can attest, continue to face. But what kind of pushback was the Baron getting?
Well, first I should point out, by contrast, after Steuben had some time to work with the troops and to instruct them, and partly because of short personality, he quickly won over certainly the common soldiers. You know, the fact that he was very colorful in terms of his language, as he put it, he trained the soldiers by force of his goddams. That he would have Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence accompany him to translate his cursing into English for him when he ran out of German and French curses.
Did he translate it accurately as far as we?
I don't know. I've never seen it transcribed. Just the act itself. And of course, soldiers appreciate somebody who has a vocabulary like that. So he already makes himself fairly popular. Within a few weeks, he already has proponents within the ranks of the army, and some of the more important major generals, people like Nathaniel Greene, for example, and Arthur St. Clair and Anthony Wayne. But there definitely was resistance, and a lot of it came for two reasons. First of all, he's a foreigner, and this is a point where, again, the officer corps in the Continental Army resents foreigners. They've seen too many of them, and too many of them were incompetent. And so the fact that Steuben just appears out of nowhere and is telling them what to do, is telling colonels who have been fighting since Bunker Hill, this is how you should run your regiment. Mm-hmm. They had a hard time swallowing that. He's a foreigner and he's a newcomer. And also, I think, too, just the fact that this is the fledgling United States, and the notion of that kind of a strict military hierarchy was a difficult one to swallow. Washington had earned that already, because Washington had been with the army from the summer of 1775 and had earned that kind of respect, but Steuben not so much. And without Washington's backing, it's hard to imagine that Steuben would have gotten very far. And Steuben's attitude does not help either. I mean, there's a couple points where Washington points out that Steuben, the individual regimental colonels think you have too much authority, and they're complaining about this. And Steuben's response was, well, if they think I don't have enough authority, I should be given more authority.
Clearly.
Exactly, so that I can force them to do what needs to be done. And de Steuben, approaching this from a military, and you might say also from a Germanic or a Prussian background, people need to forget about their pride and sublimate that, and only think about what's good for the army. And if that means you get your feelings hurt, then that's unfortunate. But that was not necessarily a popular stance to take, especially in an army that had kind of an egalitarian air to it.
So it seems that there was some xenophobia informing the resistance,
yeah.
But also this idea of kind of an outsider coming in. And Rose, you talked about the difference between internal IGs and external IGs. Can you talk about the different sort of models that exist for that, and how you thought about it when you were commissioner, and how you think about it now in your work with other jurisdictions on how to build anti-corruption mechanisms?
I think that in order to do something impartially and fairly, we can all agree that bringing in somebody external to those involved, to those who are in charge, who might be able to influence, just lends itself to a better methodology. So I only worked at an IG's office, which DOI, you could say, is for the New York City, as an external IG. I do know that because I've worked with a number of people who were there when IGs were internal to the city. It was in the past, but there was still memory and some experience with that. That when all the IGs were pulled out of their internal assignments and brought over to or under the DOI umbrella, that it was a much better and more potent and effective way to dispense fair and impartial oversight and to get to the bottom of things and to serve as a neutral party to take in the facts and be, great listeners to everybody's side on what happened with anything that was being looked at, and do it in a fair and impartial way.
So part of what we think about as inspectors general is leaving the institutions that we work with better than we found them. And one way that Baron von Steuben did it clearly was codifying the rules and regulations for the discipline of the troops. Can you talk a bit about the process of writing the Blue Book? And then Rose, I would love to hear your thoughts about how you make sure that change outlasts an individual administration.
Well, I should preface this by saying the composition of the Blue Book has been considered probably the most unpleasant thing that he had ever accomplished during his entire life. And partly because, again, he ached for the battlefield. And by the summer of 1778, after he had taken part, actually had led troops in the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, he thought he'd proven himself. And the fact that Washington has a different purpose for him, understanding that politically it made more sense to keep Steuben doing something administrative, but also understanding that Steuben had peculiar talents. That process was a lot more complicated than I think has been very often been portrayed. Sometimes it's said, well, he's a Prussian, he takes Prussian documents and he just makes them into English. And no, actually, the British manuals were almost identical to Prussian. What he did with a small group of staff officers who were like him, very extraordinarily well read. One thing to forget about Steuben is that he's a child of the Enlightenment, an extraordinarily well read man. Gets together essentially a significant library of contemporary cutting edge works on tactics, on army administration, army organization, and sits down and hammers out something that he thinks will work for Americans, which was again, he understood that the character of the American soldier was different than that, as he understood it at least, of most European soldiers and especially Prussians. But this also shows Steuben being frustrated both by his own, what he sees as a lack of progress, but also by the fact that there are definitely those around him who don't see the importance of the work the way that he did. There are several times where he flies off the handle in a rage when he thinks his work is being impeded and not being taken seriously. And sometimes he's justified in doing so, and sometimes he's not. But that's Steuben could be his own worst enemy, which definitely shows up in the composition of the Blue Book.
Well, I think to your question about how do you, as a DOI or an IG, how do you make the impact that you're having last, I think was your question. What we did then, and I still do this a bit at Bloomberg Associates working with cities, is, well, first getting back to DOI, we would investigate an issue, and when we found that there was a corruption vulnerability, we would, as you indicated, make referrals either to the Conflict of Interest Board or a prosecutor's office or back to the agency itself's disciplinary unit. And rather than just moving on, which a lot of law enforcement agencies would, we did not, because while we were external and independent, we also were part of city government. And we wanted city government, therefore, to run well and ably. And we were as invested in the robust provision of goods and services as any other agency was, or at least I was. And so what we did would be to stay behind when a case was over and sit down with the agency and the relevant people responsible for whatever process went haywire that allowed the corruption to happen. And we would set forth really the behind the scenes, what happened here, and we would recommend process and procedural changes that they should take to fix the corruption or the problem, the conflict, whatever it was, going forward. And then the referral would be taken care of, but the efficiency, the process change would also be something that would give a lasting, better improvement to the department. And we sometimes worked for weeks and weeks with agencies on those, and eventually we even hardened that to being a written policy and procedure recommendation that would be given to the agencies, and the supervisors at DOI would be tasked with following up to make sure that those changes were getting made. And we delivered those to the departments and asked them to get back to us in 30 days with the remediations that they were taking. And we comstated that as a KPI, really, to make sure that the agency was doing that. And they did. And the agencies were totally invested in making more permanent, better government, better process, where there had been a small, a medium, or a big problem that was taken care of, but it left behind a better process, a better unit, a better system of managing something in its wake.
So we have a lot of oversight experts in the audience and tuning in online, but I think that who certainly understand what we're talking about the importance of public reporting and transparency and making remedial recommendations. But for ordinary New Yorkers, can you tell a story about an investigation or a matter that you handled that had a real world impact on real New Yorkers that stands out in your mind?
There's so many of them, and I was reading through some of the materials about cases that we worked on at DOI. I haven't done that in a while, and it is just extraordinary, is all I can say. And I agree with you that it would be wonderful if people understood the benefit to the public, the benefit to individuals, and the collective more. So just a couple of examples. We did cases that involved the illegality on New York City Parks Department construction projects where the contractors were not paying the workers on those city projects the prevailing wage. In fact, they were paying them really a pittance. We uncovered that, did an undercover investigation, and brought about a criminal case. And part of the restitution was to repay retroactively all of the employees who had been working on that construction project for less than what they were entitled to. And we did that because it was a city project. I'm sure it takes place elsewhere. But when we found out that people were being exploited on a city project, that's the kind of thing that DOI responds to. We had another case where a city vendor was supposed to be monitoring and supervising and checking on foster homes to make sure that our New York City foster kids were being cared for. And they were supposed to go in and do that on a particular cadence, and the vendor was not doing that. They were doctoring paperwork as if they were doing it and submitting that, and the city was paying them for not checking on our foster kids. And so we did a case on that, and there were consequences. got somebody else in right away to check in on all those foster children, obviously got a new vendor in place. And the list just goes on and on of other cases that were so impactful for people. We did about 100 cases a year involving people who would, through corrupt and fraudulent representations, get affordable housing apartments under circumstances where they were not eligible. They would lie about their own assets in order to get those apartments. Well, every apartment taken by somebody who is not eligible for it by fraudulent means is displacing somebody on a 10-year waiting list who absolutely is eligible for it and needs that housing. And this is something in the newspapers that we read every day. And so we took those cases very seriously, investigated them, got the people who were not eligible, who had lied to the city and lied to the federal government by extension, out of those apartments, and got somebody on the wait list in where they were supposed to be. So, I mean, I could just go on and on, Lucy, and I won't, but it's one case after the other where the reality is that far from being the boogeyman, far from being, the unknown quantity, we were there jumping case after case where someone was corrupting, twisting, defrauding city assets, city property, a city contract, and hurting somebody, a resident or somebody in the city. And we were able to, through our investigative tools and powers, take great action with that. And of course, we work with great partners, the district attorneys, and you served so well in the Manhattan DA's office, and the Attorney General, the 2 U.S. Attorneys' offices, and the other law enforcement agencies, of course, throughout the city. It was a big cohort who we work with. But that's what it was about. And last but not least, of course, what we're really known for are the financial cases. We started out as the Office of the Commissioner of Accounts. And so we are known for following the money, following the paper. Heaven knows we found, I think our recoveries over the 12 years were about $550 million returned to the city's coffers from mainly outsiders, not New York City employees. The vast majority of the cases that we did ended up involving external parties, somebody who had a contract or somebody who was paying a bribe or somebody who was misusing funds and benefits that were city funds or city benefits. And so what we would do is follow the money, follow the paperwork, stop the fraud, stop the money, the tax money from sluicing out, and then recover it through forfeiture. Cities and the state do not have an endless pot of money, and everybody works quite hard for the taxes that they pay. And so we were really the guardians of taxpayers' money, and we stopped a lot of fraud in its tracks. We did a lot of financial cases. One case alone involved an IT vendor who was able to create a network of shell companies and phonied up invoices as if they were doing things in connection with this very sophisticated IT project. And unfortunately, they were able to hoodwink the city with the sophistication of this project in a way that cost the city almost $500 million in fraud over a decade. And we got it all back. And so we're known for the financial cases, but I wanted to start with some of the other types of cases that are really just the individual people in the city that can be helped, certainly by DOI and by inspectors general taking the action that they take.
Well, because the first examples you gave made me think of it, the members of our office who work under the umbrella of the Office of the Welfare Inspector General and the Workers' Compensation Fraud Inspector General can attest that very often we receive an individual complaint that seems to be something small. and that pulling on the thread can turn into something more systemic. So going back to Baron von Steuben and thinking about how oversight serves in this kind of unique role in American government, can you give an example, Paul, of a small change that the Baron made that had a dramatic or lasting impact?
Oh yeah, and one in particular, in the spring of 1779, he'd been with the Army for a little over a year, he conducted a general review of the entire Army, which was a massive undertaking, including essentially inspecting every single company, every single regiment. Particularly, he was concerned about loss of government equipment. This is something that came as a big shock to him, was that enlistments tended to be 1 or 2 year. I mean, enlistments in the Continental Army are quite short, and that soldiers, after having been issued uniforms, cartridge boxes, bayonets, scabbards, muskets, when their enlistments were up, would usually go home with all their equipment, which had been issued to them, not given to them. And Steuben was horrified to find this out. He was thinking what a massive cost this was. So he introduced the concept. Introduced the concept of the livre du soldat, the soldier's book, where every soldier would be issued a book which would list every single piece of equipment, uniforming, his weapons, even the cartridges he was issued for his musket, would all be denoted in this. And then an inspection, preferably daily, he would be, each soldier would see, the inspector, whether it was a company officer, company commander, or Steuben himself, would make sure the soldier still had these things. And then things that were lost would be taken away from, would be compensated for by being docked out of the soldier's pay. And of course the resulting effect on just the efficiency of the Army in terms of lost gear, even lost ammunition, was pretty significant. We thought every individual soldier in the Army now being held to account for everything they've been issued.
Well, I am very pleased to offer a hero's welcome to Mark Lee Greenblatt, who has been on the road from Washington, D.C. from about 6:30 this morning, and I'm so grateful to him for making the trip here. Until a year ago this week, Mark served for 5 years as Inspector General for the United States Department of the Interior, in which role he oversaw a staff of roughly 300 public servants charged with bolstering programmatic integrity in and rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal agency dedicated to managing and conserving the nation's natural resources, cultural heritage, and federal lands. In that role, former IG Greenblatt was elected by his 73 peer federal inspectors general to serve as the chairman of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, which you'll hear called SIGI, and that is the professional organization designed to promulgate best practices in the IG community. Prior to that, Mark served in leadership roles in the U.S. Department of Commerce, Office of Inspector General, and the United States Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. He is the author of Valor, which tells untold stories of 21st century American soldiers, sailors, and Marines who faced gut-wrenching decisions to overcome enormous odds. He is a frequent commentator on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, and others. He's been published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, The Hill, and many others. And particularly, over the past year, he has been one of the nation's leading voices opposing the mounting threats to independent government oversight across the country. Welcome, Mark.
Yeah, thank you.
So we've talked a bit about Baron von Steuben and the origin story of IGs. We've talked a bit about Tammany Hall and what came to pass 150 years ago in New York City. Of course, the evolution of the federal IGs is more recent than that, but older than our office. So can you tell us a little bit, Mark, about what were the conditions in America that led the federal government to create its own system of independent inspectors general?
So they started in the late 60s. There were a number of scandals involving some of the big departments and offices in the federal government. After Watergate, though, that was when there was the real explosion of IGs. Inspectors general, they went from 1 or 2 that were generally auditors into fulsome investigative and auditor entities within the 12 largest departments in the federal government. And so that was one of the big byproducts of the Watergate era. One of the big packages of the ethics reform in 1978 was the IG Act, and that created, like I said, those 12. And then over the years, they expanded from those 12 offices to, at one point it was 74, and now it's down to 72, where some agencies were closed or merged and IGs went away, but now it stands at 72.
In a functional federal government, how do IGs operate both internal to the agencies they oversee and with the other branches of government?
Sure. So IGs, we are the taxpayers' representatives inside the federal agencies. So it's a little bit different from, say, the state system where you're the IG over many different components. We have individual IGs for individual departments. And we have auditors, we have investigators, evaluators, inspectors, all under the same roof. They develop the expertise over the years. They work with the agency, not in a collaborative way, in a constructive, appropriate, arm's length relationship, but getting to know what the agency does in a very granular way. And that's crucial to build up that expertise. When I came into the Department of the Interior, I had never worked in that office before, but I had 300 staffers who had been there for years and who understood, where the proverbial bodies were buried, and that was an incredibly helpful, for me coming in as the Inspector General to rely on that deep institutional knowledge.
Can you give the audience a sense of the breadth of investigations that you handled in that role and the size of your office and the volume of savings to the public?
Sure. So the types of investigations that we did ran the gamut from low-level embezzlement by government officials. So, for example, we have the National Park Service in the Department of the Interior. Well, there are at national monuments and national parks, there's someone that takes the tickets at the gate, right? And we have had a number of situations where the individual taking the tickets, taking the money, would put 10 of those dollars in their pocket and 10 of the dollars deposited for the taxpayers for the benefit of the park. And we had a number of those over the years, hundreds of thousands of dollars that they stole for years. So that's the lower side of things. And then you have bigger, more muscular types of investigations. We have oil and gas, so all the federal lands are controlled by the Department of the Interior. So any kind of oil and gas the wells that are extracted from those lands, there's a royalty that goes to the United States, right, to the taxpayers. We have a number of situations where, just like the IRS catching folks who don't pay their taxes, we catch people who, companies who aren't paying their royalties, and that can be, tens of millions of dollars that they aren't paying at any one time. So there's a wide range of different types of investigations. Some IGs, I will note, have a more retail criminal investigations unit. And what I mean by that is that ours was looking at DOI, Department of Interior personnel, Department of Interior contractors or grant recipients, right? We wouldn't look at, for example, in the national parks, we wouldn't be like patrolling the roads of the national park looking to see whether people are crossing into areas they shouldn't go. That was for the National Park Service to take care of. We would oversee them. But there are some IGs who do that. For example, the HHS, Health and Human Services, they oversee Medicare. Well, they do Medicare, Medicaid fraud out in the field, looking at doctors, looking at prescribers, recipients, suppliers who are actually defrauding the government or defrauding their patients, what have you. So there are some that do that retail end, and those tend to be much bigger, like HHS and some of the other IG offices.
It's interesting to hear you talk about those kinds of somewhat low-level frauds that persist over a long period of time. And I wonder if you and then others can speak a bit to this kind of culture of corruption question. Now, when our office 10 years ago investigated the escape from Clinton Correctional Facility, one of the major kind of diagnoses was that there had been a culture of complacency in the department that contributed to all of these program failures that led to ultimately the conditions that contributed to the escape. So can you say a bit, Mark, about what IGs have to do with addressing culture of corruption? And then I would love to hear from both of you about that in your own areas.
Well, it's a significant issue because, unlike, say, a corporation, where ultimately there are the shareholders are there, and the board is there. There are entities that are there that are looking at the bottom line. They're looking at the dollars and cents that are going in and going out. In government, obviously, it's taxpayer dollars, so they don't have the people who are working in those fields, be it employees, contractors, or grant recipients, don't have a responsibility toward those dollars and cents. And so when you have that, you need someone there. You need to insert someone who is the taxpayer's representative. And so that's why it's our job to remind the folks there that they are doing this on behalf of the taxpayer, that there are rules in place and why they're in place. So that was one big issue for us to fight against the culture of complacency, if you will, was articulating why these anti-fraud measures, these accountability measures are so important, why they're absolutely crucial, especially in a situation where the taxpayer is so far removed from where their dollars and cents are being spent. And that's the key issue. That's why we have to engage in fraud awareness briefings. We did that all the time in terms of the Department of the Interior and the other agencies I worked for, Department of Commerce, Department of Justice. We would do anti-fraud briefings for those employees, contractors, and grant recipients all the time, specifically designed to push back on that, on the creeping complacency, which is inevitably going to arise in a bureaucracy.
Rose?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. We used to say that to city employees who were involved in some of these situations, if this was a renovation you were doing on your own home,
Right.
You would have your budget, it was your money, and you would know exactly what was being done for every dollar that was being spent. And so, in dealing with people who had a role in overseeing multi-$100 million public works projects, where by the time we're looking at something, money has been lost, over lengthy periods of time and is unaccounted for. That's exactly right. People are just too divorced from the importance of what their own role was. But to this point about how did we change a culture of corruption, I would say that the one that hit me right away was in the Department of Buildings. So when I got to DOI, we were I discovered that there had been a lengthy investigation and it needed to be taken down, involving all but one of the buildings inspectors from the DOB in one of our boroughs. And what was the case was the taking of bribes and the paying of bribes by people. I mean, it wasn't just the city employee who was engaging in the wrongdoing. Everybody for years had just become so used to paying off the building inspector, either to jump the queue or to not do the inspection at all. And so these inspectors were arrested. The individuals who paid them the bribes were not, which I changed. And the city had to undertake a multi-million-dollar contract to rip up the streets in order to inspect the gas lines that no one knew whether or not they were actually inspected, because the inspectors were just taking, frankly, petty bribes, $50, $100. The city spent millions. How unfair to rip up the streets, to have to check whether or not something was going to go boom in the night. And so the buildings department got my attention very quickly. People wanted me to do a blue ribbon panel to study it. I said no. I sat down with the buildings commissioner, and I said, this is what we need to do together. He could not have agreed, they could not have agreed more. There were two commissioners that I dealt with who were equally fantastic and collaborative at an arm's length. And we began to work with the inspectors, and this didn't happen overnight. This is a long game, but I had 12 years. After about 5 years, we had more buildings inspectors who were reporting offers of bribes to them than taking the bribes. We changed the culture. DOI works so closely with the DOB and the inspectional cadres at the DOB, and shifted what was happening, gave them a lot of attention and a lot of praise. And when they turned in a complaint that somebody offered them money, we had the commissioner do a congratulatory memo for that employee's personnel file, and eventually people started getting recognized for doing the right thing. The commissioner was very visible. We were very visible, both as a prophylactic, but also there to help them, take their calls, take their issues. At the end of the day, we had a real culture shift at the DOB because we worked together.
Yeah. Paul, you talked a bit about how maintaining supplies helped to change the tenor of the troops. What other ways did von Steuben contribute to the culture change?
Well, it's interesting you bring up there's definitely a clash of cultures. In fact, I would argue with this. And I tell my students very often, we deal with the pre-industrial West. That the past is a foreign country. They do things different there. And that people have different values and fears and aspirations than we like to think that they do. And this definitely applies to corruption. There's definitely a much lower threshold of what's acceptable for political corruption. Bribery is just part of how business is done, and it's fairly open. But Steuben came from a tradition in Prussia and in German states in general in the 18th century that we sometimes refer to as cameralism, the science of government, as emerges in the 18th century, which emphasizes efficiency and integrity. But that's something quite new and really more of a feature of the Enlightenment era. And that's what Steuben represents. Certainly Frederick the Great and his father, Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia, emphasized this a political culture that saw corruption as bad, because there was not really a strong notion that it was prior to the middle of the 18th century. But Steuben had to deal with that, certainly. And I think that's one of the reasons that very often he was seen as German, even though he didn't really see himself as a German. The other issue is, of course, where it comes to the culture of corruption here, is that where it comes to government waste, where it comes to waste in in particular within the ranks of the Continental Army, the concept of the United States as a central government, as a polity, is not really there yet, despite the Declaration of Independence, despite some early notions and early signs of American nationalism. Certainly the average soldier in the Continental Army doesn't see himself as an American. He sees himself as somebody from Connecticut or from Massachusetts or from Pennsylvania. And the notion that there is that there is this political entity called America and that we owe something to it is kind of foreign to the average soldier, and for that matter, the average officer. Which is, I think, where a lot of that waste comes from, with soldiers simply walking off with their muskets and their cartridge boxes. That, it's branded U states on it, but what difference does that make? Do I really owe anything to this united united group of former colonies?
And of course, by the time the subjects of Mark's beautiful book, Valor, entered the military, that has changed dramatically. Mark, Rose gave some examples of cases she handled at DOI that affected real human beings. I know this is an area of passion for you. So in addition to the savings and the program integrity, can you give an example that stands out in your mind of work you did at the Department of the Interior, IG, that impacted real Americans?
Sure. There are a couple of cases that come to mind. One of them involved a school board. So the Department of the Interior manages the federal government's relationship with the Native American tribe. We give them an enormous amount of grant money and for education or whatever it is, a wide variety of different things. And they have certain responsibilities on how they can use those grant funds. And for one of the investigations, we found that the school board had taken federal grant money and gone on what was essentially a vacation. There was a one-day conference in Hawaii that had nothing to do with education. And not only did the entire school board fly out, they also took their family for the full week. And so we ended up indicting the entire school board. And the reason why is because they were taking hundreds of thousands of dollars. There were other issues. That doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? There are other things that we identified. But the reason why that stands out to me is because that's money that should be going for books, that should be going to teacher salaries. I mean, they struggle so hard in attracting teachers to the reservation schools, and here's the school board going for a family jaunt to Hawaii, totally unrelated to education. The really sad thing is that was not the only school board that we indicted. In my tenure, we ultimately indicted 3 completely different school boards, completely different tribes. And that was heartbreaking to me, because you're talking about those kids who are in schools that are really dilapidated. I mean, schools that are not up to snuff, that you would not send your kids to probably. And here are the school boards taking that money and buying themselves, literally buying nice cars, getting makeovers. I'm not exaggerating when I say this, and it breaks your heart, but those are real. My office viewed the Native American school kids as the most vulnerable people in our portfolio. And so that was particularly frustrating for me when we would get these allegations and then investigate and bear them out. That was very frustrating for us, but I felt like we were at least holding them responsible. And then sending the message out to the rest of the school boards, like, we're actually watching. We want you to be spending the money, the grant money that's coming from our taxpayer base, to go to fund, asbestos removal, to fund teacher salaries, not to spend on jaunts to Hawaii.
Because we share your commitment in particular to directing resources to the programs that support the most vulnerable community members, we're really thinking a lot in this, our 40th year, about what we call bringing the public into public integrity. Von Steuben is quoted as having once said, "You say to your soldier, do this, and he does it. But I am obliged to say to the American, this is why you ought to do this, and then he does it." Paul, what did von Steuben mean by that? And then if we can talk a bit about the obligation of inspectors general to tell these stories and to bring the public in. Paul?
What Steuben meant by that, and it was a letter he wrote to a former comrade in the Prussian army, was pointing out what to him was the obvious difference between American character and European character, if he could reduce it to that kind of generalization. His argument was that Americans were not bred to habits of deference the way that the soldiers he was familiar with, who came primarily from what we call the Third Estate, obviously in Europe, primarily peasants, but also the urban poor, that they were accustomed to doing what they were told to do by somebody in a position of authority over them, where he noted that with Americans, and it was something that first surprised him and annoyed him also, and he gradually came to treasure about Americans, was that he had to explain himself. So if he's whether it's teaching the manual of arms and the postures with the musket and the loading procedure, it was done differently than the way they were taught. Why is it done differently? Well, tell me why we're doing this differently than the way I've been doing it for the past 2 years. And he said once this is explained to them, they're fine with it. But he recognized that this was an entirely different culture that he was dealing with in America than what he was familiar with in Europe.
And so insofar as Americans have this real need to understand and rightly call upon us to justify the expenditures, Mark, can you talk a bit about why we need to bring the public in?
Yeah, I think IGs, frankly, have flown under the radar for far too long. And this is something we need to do to alert the American people, the taxpayers of New York, what we do, how we add value. One, to raise awareness, right, so that folks are attuned to these, waste, fraud, and abuse stories. Because I think then if they're working in government or if they're working for a contractor or a grant recipient, they know that there are these landmines out there. But also I think it's important to build support for what we're doing, that we're adding value. How do we add value? The fact is when I was fired, right, in almost exactly a year ago, I did a bunch of media. Lucy talked about it a few minutes ago. Invariably, the first question was, who are you and what do you do? What do IGs do? No one really knew, and the reporters, the anchors or whatever, knew that, and they had to set the foundation so that people could care. That's a problem from my perspective. What I want to do, what I basically made my mission over the last year or so, is to make IGs more prominent so that people know. Because when we're taken out of the shadows and are a known entity, it comes with power. And I'm not talking about wielding power in some, totalitarian way, but what it means that your work has more impact, right? So when you write recommendations, they have a bit more punch. The agency is more willing to implement those changes, right? So that, or stakeholders, the folks in the legislature, the governor, whoever it is, will be more receptive. It'll have more credibility. But if you're working in the shadows, then your reports can just get thrown away in the trash because no one's paying attention. And so I think that's what we need to do. We need to be able to market our work so that people are invested in what we're doing and are on board. And I think that just will be a sea change. I think it will happen, but I think it will take some effort. My analogy is no one was talking about tariffs 2 years ago. Right? Now, tariffs, it's every other day it's in the news. Well, I think we can do that with IGs. It may take some time, right? Donald Trump isn't going to talk about it every other day, right? But that's the kind of thing I think we can have, that societal education. It's going to take some time, but I think it's important for us to do.
Yeah. Rose?
I mean, I think it's been said, obviously there has to be great communication about the impact that a DOI is having. I certainly saw immediately that there was not enough communication about the mission of the agency. It was therefore viewed with secrecy and who are they? Are they the KGB, or do they go over and tell City Hall what's going on, in real time? And all these sort of, misimpressions were very much out there. And so I think communication and consistency, we ramped up a anti-corruption or corruption prevention lecture program where we in person went to every single city agency, not each one every month, but we had these sessions, these confidential lectures and in-person sessions every single month on a schedule. And the way I know that that was impactful is that the number of calls that we were getting to our own hotline went up and up and up over the years that we were there by going in person And we heard incredible stories about what people had been seeing, what people wanted to talk about. And, you know, the unique thing in New York City is that there is a rule that city governments who know about corruption definitively have to report it to DOI under penalty of discipline, including up to termination if they don't. But sticking your head in the sand is, by law, not acceptable in New York. Now, the companion rule in New York is we have a very strong whistleblower protection statute. So you have to come forward, but you will be protected if you do. And DOI was the keeper of the whistleblower statute. And so we would investigate anybody who retaliated over somebody coming forward and reporting something that they knew about. But getting back to, you know, how did we get the flow of communication coming to us? Well, it was building trust and confidence, and it was in some cases even alerting people to the fact of our existence in our own city. We have 350,000 employees in the city. And so going out there physically, you know, social media was somewhat new at the time. It was coming on. We started to use that immediately. And so I think that when people met us in person, understood that we were there to help them, a lot of people really wanted to, you know, air things that were going on. They saw we didn't tell anybody. We kept confidences. I came out of the U.S. Attorney's Office. We had cooperators and we protected them with our lives. And so protecting confidences at DOI was certainly part of the regimen. People knew that. They started to appreciate it. And the press corps was extremely interested in what we were doing. I can assure you, we were known to them. They wanted, they were doing their own investigative journalism, and fantastic tips came from the press, but they certainly were behind us and knew what the value of what we were doing. They reported in the papers every day. I'm still addicted to all the New York papers. I'll never stop, because it was almost like they were, you know, an extension of us and vice versa. So I think that, you know, in sum, you're right. What is an inspector general? You know, I had the title of commissioner. My son, when he was 2, he thought I was the police commissioner. I was the only commissioner he heard of. And so it's a little bit of an inside baseball title. But I think most people in New York know that there's a DOI. Most employees know that there's a DOI. And, you know, the commissioners over the years have had to do some tough cases. You know, but I think that I started doing a fiscal year-end report and a calendar year-end report, just putting everything out there in summary fashion. Hey, this is what we did the last 6 months. This is what we did this year. This is what we saved you. And, you know, this is how we help people. This is the dollars that were retrieved. And it really kind of took off. And I think it's maintained at that level.
So I hope that we've persuaded anyone in the audience who wasn't persuaded about the incredible import of inspectors general. But I want to talk a little bit more back to Mark's point about threats and the threats that we're facing to inspectors general now. So Mark, if you can talk a little bit about what happened to you and your colleagues and the damage that you see being done to government writ large as a result.
So in the campaign season leading up to the election, the last election, there was some open discussion about whether Trump, if he won, would fire, you know, any of the IGs. People were thinking 2 or 3 IGs might get fired,
including folks he'd appointed.
Right, exactly. He appointed me. And I was the chair of the council at the time, and there were a number of folks that were, you know, everyone's kind of playing the game of like, you know, who do you think, you know. Then when he was elected, things started to ramp up. His former chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, wrote an op-ed in the New York Post, actually, that said he recommended 3 changes that President Trump should make. The first one was fire the IGs. So that was at the New York Post. Project 2025. One of the authors of that was on. It was in an interview during the transition period, and he too recommended firing IGs. So it was out in the ether. And then comes Inauguration Day. My phone didn't ring. Okay. Next day, phone didn't ring. Okay. Maybe they're not going to fire anyone.
You're still just doing your investigation?
Yeah, just doing our things, and you know, okay, well, maybe he's not going to fire anyone. Well, come to the first Friday, which was the fourth day of the administration, I was actually in Taekwondo class. I'm walking home, and my phone lights up, and I look, and it's a message from the White House. It was a 2-sentence email that said, your service as Inspector General of the Department of the Interior is terminated effective immediately, citing changing priorities. And then the second of the 2 sentences said, thank you for your service. I immediately called my successor as the chair of the Council of IGs, and I said, Mike, I just got fired. And he said, me too. Well, that's when I knew. That's when I knew we were in big, big trouble. Mike, by the way, was also appointed by President Trump in the first term. So if the two of us were getting fired, this is going to be really, really bad. And it finally came out over that weekend that there were 17 of us who had gotten fired. And that was the start of a series of major challenges with respect to accountability in the federal government. There were multiple other IGs who have been fired since then, the most notable of which was Paul Martin at the U.S. AID, Agency for International Development. About 2 weeks after we got fired, this is when they were cutting U.S. aid completely. He issued a report identifying some of the problems associated with the cutting of those funds, of the funding, the grant funding, including the problem that the folks with the money out in the world, out in the field, don't have any accountability measures. So all the problems that we're identifying in the federal government, who knows what's happening in Zambia or whatever. He issued that report identifying risks about the removal of USAID protections. He was fired within 24 hours. So there was a direct nexus. You do this work that's critical of the government, you get fired. That one it wasn't a shot across the bow. We were effectively a shot across the bow. He was a direct hit. If you do real oversight, you're going to get fired. So that's the big concern to me, is that going to engender a chilling effect on the rest of the Inspector General community, on the rest of the accountability mechanisms throughout the federal government? And there are 14,000 people working in the federal IG space, the auditors and investigators, what have you. They're great people, they're good professionals, and I think they go to work every day trying to do the right thing. And so on the ground level auditing, on the ground level investigations, I think they're doing good work. The question is, what happens to those politically sensitive matters? What happens when a new IG comes in with a partisan background? We've seen 8 of this second round of IGs in the second term. 8 of them have been confirmed. 6 of them have come from either this administration or Trump's first term, right? So they're political partisan backgrounds. Are they going to be willing to do hard-hitting investigations about their agencies, about Trump-era programs in their portfolio? That is the concern. That's where the chilling effect meets is the rubber on the road. I mean, to mix all kinds of metaphors there. But that's really the issue: are those folks going to be able to look at senior level misconduct in their agencies? Are they going to be able to look at sensitive programs inside their portfolio? I'll give you just one example. The new IG at HHS, Health and Human Services, he said in his confirmation hearing that he is going to use his office, going to conduct audits, evaluations, inspections, investigations to support the president's initiatives, to support Secretary Kennedy. He actually said that, right? That is the opposite of what we should be doing. We're not there to support a policy outcome, right? We're there to be the taxpayers' representatives inside the federal government, right? We're there to call balls and strikes. And so if you are telling the American people, I'm going to be doing this to support the president's agenda, how can the American people take what their findings are with any credibility? They're going to have to take them with a grain of salt, right? And that's the key issue to me. Is there a chilling effect, or is there someone who's going to put a thumb on the scale in favor of one administration, or on the flip side, against another administration, right? If that HHS IG, he's now the IG there, if they get allegations of misconduct in the Biden administration, are they going to be fair there? Are they going to put their thumb on the scale toward finding misconduct? Just like on the flip side, are they going to be putting their thumb on the scale toward exonerating a Trump-era administration, Trump administration official? That's the sort of credibility gap that we face, and that is a 5-alarm fire from my perspective.
And coincident with this deterioration, we are also seeing it happen in jurisdictions across the country. The city of Atlanta IG resigned after the city council that created her role stripped her of her authorities, and that's only one example. But surely, Paul, these threats to independence aren't new. What kind of, aside from operating under limited resources, as all IGs and government officials do, what kind of threats did von Steuben experience when he was trying to do something so new for the Army?
Well, a lot of it came down to, I already mentioned the xenophobia. Xenophobia, of course, is definitely an issue. But a lot of it comes down to that resistance to the notion of the United States as a discrete entity. But for where it comes to Steuben's, the chief source of resistance tended to be from individual regimental commanders. They're the ones who really objected to his prescriptions. It all came down to this is my province. This regiment is my thing, and that the federal government, such as they understood it, had no business interfering in that. So, but of course, this is a different era, obviously, and different concept about the extent of federal authority.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience that I think we have ready. In the meantime, the World Fair song that we just heard, called von Steuben, part drill master and part mother hen. Thank you. Is that consistent with his leadership ethos, and does that resonate at all to you two as in thinking about being an inspector general?
The mother hen thing, I think, applies to him at Valley Forge. Of course, but that's how we remember Steuben. I think we oftentimes forget about the whole issue about not knowing what inspector generals do. Inspectors general, that Steuben's main contribution is still not the thing we tend to think of. We tend to think of him swearing at the troops in the snow at Valley Forge, and the mother hen definitely is an aspect of that.
Well, to follow up on that, someone from the audience has asked if we know whether von Steuben consciously viewed himself as a watchdog or reformer, or more of a drill master.
Oh, he hated the drill master thing. That's why I objected to the title. The title was imposed upon me, by the way. I didn't have much choice in that. My editor picked that one out for me. That he thought this was while it was very important, and nobody else was doing it, and he had to do it. That the creation of that infrastructure and that oversight was to him far more important. And of course, both of them, though, were means to an end because he really wanted to be in battle. I mean, that's the undertone in almost everything he writes.
So, Mark, I know that you think of yourself in many ways as a mother hen. I want to speak a little bit to your leadership ethos and whether you think that's relevant. But someone from the audience has also asked, IG offices were designed to be independent and nonpartisan. They're now operating in this intensely polarized environment. What is the single most important habit or principle an IG must protect to maintain public trust when findings may be unpopular?
I think it's just independence and that willingness to take the heat. I had a number of controversial reports come out in my tenure, but perhaps the most controversial was about the clearing of Lafayette Park during the George Floyd riots, the Black Lives Matter riots in 2020. I don't know if you all remember that. It was quite a violent episode where they cleared out the protesters. Lafayette Park is sitting right outside the White House. They cleared out the protesters, and then President Trump came out and he stood with the Bible in front of St. John's Church, which had just gotten burned the night before. It was a very symbolic moment, very controversial. And so the question was, did the Park Police, which is part of the Department of the Interior, therefore under my jurisdiction, did the Park Police clear all those people in a very violent way in order to give the president a photo op? Right? And the narrative was yes, and the timing really looks like that's exactly what happened. But we looked at the matter, and we looked at the evidence, and there was real evidence, contemporaneous evidence, messages, texts, all the witness, all the witness statements from our interviews, but also the bare facts were there that they had already started to put up an anti-scale fencing, basically to push out the perimeter of the protests a little bit in order to protect the monuments and protect the Park Police folks who were there. They had the contractors who were already on the ground. The contract had been let earlier, and all of this, but way before anything happened with the White House. And so we wrote that report. I published it, that it was not because of the president's visit, that they were going on a completely different path. It had nothing to do with the president. Well, that upset, obviously, half of the country. Apparently half of the country has Twitter and was screaming at me on Twitter. And the thing that I no one likes to read the negative comments, right? They all say, don't read the comments, right? What's the first thing I did? I read the comments, right? Of course you read the comments. I will say that I didn't take offense at them because I knew what we were doing was grounded in the facts and grounded in the evidence. And so I think that might be the biggest technique, if you will. It's just sticking with the damn facts. I don't know any other way to say it. It's just stick with the facts and take solace in what the evidence says. People are going to disagree with you. That is the nature of the beast. The one thing I would say about that, about taking the heat, is that gave me some measure of comfort, was that it meant we were having impact, right? It meant we weren't operating in the shadows where no one cared about what we were doing. If people were, yelling and screaming about what we're doing, well, they're at least talking about our findings. They're talking about our recommendations, and that I thought was at least a good thing. Usually, it had a hashtag of Fire Greenblatt. And then,
lo and behold.
Right. It took him a year. Actually, the irony is that President Trump issued a statement where he thanked me by name for that report, and I was live on ABC News when that statement came out, and the anchor asked me about it. And I was like, oh God, I don't want to make this politicized. It was a disaster, and I basically said, no, that's not, we don't want that. We don't want to be politicized. But that's the key. I think that's the key nugget of truth, is stick with the evidence, stick with the facts, and you'll be able to withstand pretty much anything.
And of course, there are structural mechanisms that can help protect the ability to call balls and strikes and rows. In fact, I think the past 2 DOI commissioners have investigated the mayor whom appointed them. Someone from the audience asks, can an IG really be independent at any level if they can be fired for speaking the truth? You want to talk a little bit about what prevents that from happening?
I can only speak to my experience, which is that Mayor Bloomberg had zero tolerance for corruption, and his instructions to me at the outset were quite simple, and that was to do your job without fear or favor and let the chips, also known as the facts, fall wherever they may, and that's what I did.
And there are a whole variety of protections in place, including in New York State, that the Inspector General can't be fired by the governor who appoints them. And Mark, if you want to talk a bit about the protections that should be in place for federal IGs.
So traditionally, the IGs have stood, have lasted through administrations. They're appointed in an apolitical fashion, and that's in the IG Act. It says without consideration to their political affiliation. It started under Carter in 1978. Reagan came in. It was the first transition of power with IGs. At this point, there were 12. And Reagan came in and fired all of the political appointees, which would include the 12 IGs. Well, the folks in Congress actually blew a gasket and said, no, 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 no. The whole point of this is that they don't change with every administration. They don't become just regular partisan actors, political players, members of the administration. They ride through administrations not unlike federal judges. So Reagan actually brought them back, brought half of them ended up coming back. And that set the precedent that IGs stay through political transitions, through changes of administration. Over the years, you have some IGs that do get removed for misconduct, right? There are a large number of them. Some of them make mistakes. They're human, and they get removed for misconduct. Happens rarely, but it happens. This was the first time that we've had a departure from those norms, where a president has come in at the beginning of the administration and fired any IGs. This is going back to Reagan in 1981. And so for the Trump administration to come in and fire folks on day 4, 17, that was a significant shift, a significant challenge to the norms that we had that would protect us. And there are statutory protections, like in the IG Act, the president must give 30 days notice in advance of firing an IG to Congress so that the Congress can engage and basically oversee the situation. And then the president must give substantive rationale for each individual IG as to why they were fired. President Trump did neither of those. And basically he's saying all of those provisions are unconstitutional. You, Congress, under Article 1, have no authority to limit my ability to fire presidential appointees in the executive branch. That's something that ultimately the Supreme Court's going to have to decide. But the real key issue here is getting back to those norms. We can have statutory notification provisions. You can ask for substantive rationale. But that's not really going to handcuff a president. It's those social norms. That's the political norms that we have to insist on. And that's where, when I was talking about marketing IGs, and so the American people know about IGs, no one's going to care if an IG gets fired unless the American people know about it and care, and ask their congressperson, ask their senators in town halls, and say, what are you doing to support IGs? That's the vision in my mind. It may take 10 years, to get there, but I think that's ultimately where we need to go, where we're not operating in the shadows, where we're operating in a much more public fashion, and therefore the American people will know and care, and that will be the governor on the president's ability to fire for purely political reasons.
And on any executive's ability to do the same. So that is the homework to all of you when we depart tonight. Paul, the end of von Steuben's life was not a happy one. Can you give some color to his final years here in New York State?
Sure. Steuben never received what he was promised in terms of compensation. He had been lobbying for it and had his friends and allies, notably Thomas Jefferson, lobbying for him at the very last part of the Revolutionary War, and continued to serve as an advisory function well into the 1780s. In fact, that Steuben is largely responsible for establishing the organizational basis for the post-war army as it existed before the War of 1812. But he was down on his luck, and at this point too, all his allies who had been in Congress before were largely gone. This is a different Congress than the Congress of 1778. So he's too poor to leave the United States. He talks about it, but he was too poor to leave the United States. Too poor to live in New York City, which is what he loved. New York City was his favorite place, and his attempts to redeem himself financially by investing in one land speculation scheme after another mostly turned out to be dead ends. I mean, of course, he was fairly land rich. He's granted a great deal of land by several states. In fact, he has there's a portion of land in Clinton County, Ohio, just a little bit east of Cincinnati, that is still marked in a deed book dated like 1804, if I remember correctly, long after Steuben was dead. So his final years are spent, first as at one level as a critic of what he saw as the the impending demise of the American Republic. He really thought that the next generation of Americans was not living up to the sacrifices made by those of the revolutionary generation, and trying to cobble together a living, and hence the estate at Remsen, that doesn't really turn out to be much of anything, much as he hoped it would become almost plantation-like. It never transcended being essentially a log cabin. Yeah. So his last few years are spent complaining about not only about his status, but what he sees as the lost opportunity that was America.
Well, I feel sure we all share the hope that we don't end up embittered about the country. So, Mark and Rose, if you could leave the audience with one takeaway based on your careers in oversight, I guess optimistic or otherwise, about why oversight matters now, what would that be?
When Bloomberg Associates was founded by Mayor Bloomberg, what he said to me was he wanted me to be part of it, and he wanted there to be a municipal integrity transparency practice component to it, because he found it just so enormously important that when he was mayor, that there was oversight. And he wanted that for the sake of a good, clean government, one that was running well under always challenging circumstances, one that was as free of corruption and fraud and waste as possible. He just found it to be so important that is one of the disciplines that is now part of the Bloomberg Associate practice. So I would say to those of you who work with the IG's office, you're doing a great job, and you're doing an important job, and people do notice it. You're not as invisible as you think, and stay true to your own values. And if you get asked to do something that isn't right, then don't do it. And work with one another, and rely on one another, and keep going. Stay away from the politics. There's no place for politics in an IG's office, and keep your head down. And if you have to walk away, it's tough, but you have to walk away. When I was talking to people about whether or not I should take the job as DOI commissioner way back when, I spoke with one former mayor, a number of former DOI commissioners, a number of former criminal justice coordinators, a number of federal judges who had been in key positions in city government, a number of former corporation counsels. So you can tell I vetted the heck out of whether or not I should take this job. I had other opportunities. And one of my advisors said to me, because I had decided to take it, just make sure that you take it knowing that every single morning you're going to wake up thinking, I might have to resign from this job. And that was part of my DNA, and people knew it. And so it's not easy. It's not an easy job, but you are there. And I think a whole lot of people know how important oversight is, and independent examination of facts is. And at the municipal level, it's very different from what Mark is talking about. It's about the city's fiscal resources, which people really find to be very tangible, and people, I think, rely on the work that you do, and so keep up the great work is what I have to say. Mark?
So I actually, despite the partisanship that we're seeing in the polarized environment that we're in, I think there are some nuggets of goodness there that are actually quite heartening to me. For example, when we're talking about fraud, a lot of talk about what's happening in Minnesota with respect to fraud. The good thing to me is that everyone's universally condemning fraud as a bad thing. It's not like we still have those social mores in place in our society where that's wrong and bad, and reflexively the American people are pushing back on that. That, to me, to pull out some silver lining on what could be a polarized dark cloud, that to me is heartening. That we still have that we are universally opposed. That's a bad thing, and everyone agrees on that. We're not even debating that, in terms of whether we should let it slide. Mind you, in other cultures around the world, it's not taken for granted, and so I'm glad that we have those social mores in place. In terms of other things that I think are optimistic is the technology that we have at our fingertips in the oversight space is just getting better and better and better. And what we can do with that to cross data streams and tease out potential problem areas is exciting to me. I think that's great. I think that's the wave of the future. We had a review recently, this is probably a couple of years ago. It wasn't my office, but it was the Department of Veterans Affairs had a list of veterans who were claiming disabilities, obviously, and they married that up with data from the Department of Transportation of folks who were getting pilot's licenses and crossing those. Well, on the one hand, they're telling the VA, I'm very, very disabled because they want to get more money. But on the other hand, they're telling the Department of Transportation, I'm fine. I got no problems. I can fly a plane, right? How do you marry up those two things? Well, they looked at that, and it's a huge number of people. And they were gaming the system in both directions. And so that, to me, was kind of brilliant. I had never even thought about that kind of thing. But when you have these experts, these folks who can, look at the data, slice and dice the data, I think that's really fantastic. And very, very optimistic, or I'm very optimistic, that the future is going to be really cool in terms of what they can do with those data sets. So I think there are a lot of nuggets of goodness. The other thing is, at least at the federal level, like I said, there are 14,000 people who wake up every day thinking, how can I fight waste, fraud, and abuse today? And those are great professionals, and I am very heartened by their presence, and I'm sure it's the same in your office and in the state and local IGs throughout the country. That's very heartening to me, is that we have those teams of people looking after our tax dollars. I just wish they were bigger. You know what I mean, right? I know that when I was at Interior, I could triple the size of my office, and we would pay for ourselves. And so that's, I think that's something that hopefully will come with time. But just the manpower that we have, the talent that we have in our offices. I had some opportunity to spend time with two of your agents today, or two of your investigators today. Shout out to Bobby and Jimmy; they were fantastic. But folks like that are oriented in the right way. That gives me great solace amidst the turmoil that we have and the setbacks that we're facing right now. That I think we're going to be okay in the long run.
From your mouth to God's ears. Yes. Before we close with a special performance, please join me in thanking these outstanding people.
Rose Gill, Paul Walker, and Mark Greenblatt.
Good to see you. Sorry.
I also want to thank everyone who helped make tonight a success, many of whom are listed behind me. I have to offer particular thanks to Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation Acting Commissioner Moser, Historic Preservation Program Coordinator Travis Bowman, the leadership of the New York State Museum, the New York State Park Police, Archives Partnership Trust Director Janet Braga, Brian Keogh, New York State Archivist, and all of their teams. But my thanks and congratulations are due really most of all to my colleagues, past and present, from the New York State offices of the Inspector General, who are tuning in from around the state, and some of whom are here with us in person tonight. So I'd like to invite current and former staff to please stand so I can share with you this citation from Governor Hochul on all of your behalf. Whereas New York State strives to maintain the excellence and accountability of its government institutions, as well as residents' trust in those institutions, it is therefore appropriate that we acknowledge the offices of the Inspector General for New York State on the occasion of their 40th anniversary. And it goes on to enumerate precisely why. Now, therefore, I, Kathy Hochul, Governor of the State of New York, hereby confer this special citation upon the offices of the Inspector General with best wishes for continued success. This is for you, my wonderful team. Thank you. Here's to 40 more years and beyond. And finally, I am pleased to introduce my very favorite actor to close out the evening's program. A celebrated stage and screen actor, Stephen Lang is best known for his role as Colonel Miles Quaritch in the Avatar trilogy, and is known for his one-person play, Beyond Glory, which celebrates the stories of 8 Medal of Honor winners. He is a lifelong New Yorker, proudly a steward of the New York State Archives Trust, and a member of the Actors Studio. But notably, for tonight, he is largely responsible for my own deep love of New York, for American history, and for our shared wholehearted belief in the durability of democracy when it is shepherded by people and institutions of integrity. I give you Stephen Lang reading the Baron von Steuben.
Good evening. Come in. Now,
New York State Trooper
Baron,
along
the good
with dog
Baron.
enter the stage.
the good Baron traveled with a wolfhound named Azor, and reputedly, when he met General Washington, he said, "This is Azor, and he detests tyrants." Washington looked at him hard, and the Baron said, "We mean George III, not you." That may not be true. Regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States by Frederick William Baron von Steuben. We've got a lot of ground to cover, folks. This could take longer than Avatar, Fire and Ash. However, with the help of the Inspector General, we culled a bit, and now I want to just give you a selection from the manual. The arms and accoutrements of the officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers should be uniform throughout. The officers who execute their function on horseback are to be armed with swords. The platoon officers with swords and espantoons, the non-commissioned officers with swords, firelocks, and bayonets, and the soldiers with firelocks and bayonets. Chapter 2. The officers and non-commissioned officers of each regiment are to be perfectly acquainted with the manual, exercise, marchings, and firings, that they may be able to instruct their soldiers when necessary. They must also be acquainted with the dress, discipline, and police of the troops, and with everything that relates to the service. The commanding officer of each regiment is to be answerable for the general instruction of the regiment and is to exercise or cause to be exercised the officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers whenever he thinks proper. Chapter 3. On the formation of a company. A company is to be formed in 2 ranks at 1 pace distance, with the tallest men in the rear and both ranks sized with the shortest men of each in the center. A company thus drawn up is to be divided into 2 sections or platoons. The captain to take post on the right of the first platoon, covered by a sergeant. The lieutenant on the right of the second platoon, also covered by a sergeant. The ensign 4 paces behind the center of the company. The first sergeant 2 paces behind the center of the first platoon, and the eldest corporal 2 paces behind the second platoon. The other 2 corporals, presumably younger, are to be in the flanks of the front rank. Chapter 5. on the instruction of recruits. The commanding officer of each company is charged with the instruction of his recruits. And as that is a service that requires not only experience but patience and a temper not met with every officer, he is to make choice of an officer, sergeant, and 2 corporals of his company who, being approved of by the colonel, are to attend particularly to that business. But in the case of the arrival of a great number of recruits, every officer without distinction is to be employed in the service. The recruits must be taken singly and first taught to put on their accoutrements and carry themselves properly. The position of a soldier without arms, he's to stand straight and firm upon his legs, with the head turned to the right so far as to bring the left eye over the waistcoat buttons, the heels 2 inches apart, the toes turned out, the belly drawn in a little but without constraint, the breast a little projected, the shoulders square to the front and kept back, and the hands hanging down the sides with the palms close to the thighs. Attention! At this word, the soldier must be silent, stand firm and steady, moving neither hand nor foot except as ordered, but attend carefully to the words of command. This attention of the soldier must be observed in the strictest manner till he receives the word rest, at which time he may refresh himself by moving his hands or feet, but must not sit down or quit his place unless permitted to do so. Attention! To the left, dress! Yes, yes, yes. At this word, the soldier turns his head briskly to the left so as to bring his right eye in the direction of his waistcoat buttons. To the right, dress! The soldier dresses again to the right, as before. The recruit must then be taught the facings. To the right, face! 2 motions. Turn briskly on both heels to the right, lifting up the toes a little and describing a quarter of a circle. Bring back the right foot to its proper position without stamping. To the left, face. 2 motions. Turn to the left, as before, to the right. Bring up the right foot to its present position. To the right, about, face. 3 motions. Step back with the right foot, bringing the buckle opposite to the left heel, at the same time seizing the cartridge box with the right hand. Turn briskly on both heels and describe a half circle. Bring back the right foot at the same time quitting the cartridge box. When the recruit is sufficiently expert in the foregoing points, he must be taught the different steps. The common step is 2 feet, about 75 in a minute. To the front, march! The soldier steps off with his left foot and marches a free, easy, and natural step without altering the position of his body or head, taking care to preserve a proper balance and not cross his legs, but to march without constraint in every sort of ground. The officer must march sometimes in his front and sometimes at his side in order to join example to precept. Halt! At this word, the soldier stops short. On the foot then advanced, immediately bringing up the other without stamping. Chapter 13. This is against all my principles, you know, appearing on stage with a dog. The next thing that's going to happen is they're going to put a kid on stage with me, and then I'm totally screwed, okay? Chapter 13 of the firings. Firing by battalion. Caution. Take care to fire by battalion. Battalion, make ready, take aim, fire. If there be more than 1 battalion to fire, they are to do it in succession from right to left. But after the first round, the odd battalions fire so soon as the respective battalions on their left begin to shoulder. And even battalions fire when the respective battalions on the right begin to shoulder. Firing by divisions and platoons. Caution. Take care to fire by division. Division, make ready, take aim, fire. They fire in the same order as prescribed for battalions in Article 1. Yes. Don't dispute me. The firing by platoons is also executed in the same order in the wings of the battalion, beginning with the right of each. That is, the 1st and 5th platoon give the first fire, the 2nd and 6th the second fire, the 3rd and 7th the third fire, and the 4th and 8th the fourth fire, after which they fire as before prescribed. You get that? Firing advancing. The battalion advances. Receive the word, battalion, halt! Take care to fire by division. They fire as before. Instruction for the captain. The captain cannot be too careful of the company the state has committed to his charge. He must pay the greatest attention to the health of his men, their discipline, arms, accoutrements, ammunition, clothes, and necessaries. His first object should be to gain the love of his men, by treating them with every possible kindness and humanity, inquiring into their complaints, and when well-founded, seeing them redressed. He should know every man in his company by name and character. He should often visit those who are sick, speak tenderly to them, see that the public provision, whether of medicine or diet, is duly administered, and procure them besides such comforts and conveniences are in his power. The attachment that arises from this kind of attention to the sick and wounded is almost inconceivable. It will, moreover, be the means of preserving the lives of many valuable men. He must divide his company into 4 squads, placing each under the particular care of an uncommissioned officer who is to be answerable for the dress and behavior of the men in his squad. He must be very particular in the daily and weekly inspections of his men, causing all deficiencies to be immediately supplied, and when he discovers any irregularity in the dress or conduct of any soldier, he must not only punish him, but the non-commissioned officer to whose squad he belongs. He must keep a strict eye over the conduct of the non-commissioned officers, oblige them to do their duty with the greatest exactness, and use every possible means to keep up a proper subordination between them and the soldiers, for which reason he must never rudely reprimand them in presence of the men, but at all times treat them with proper respect. He must pay the utmost attention to everything which contributes to the health of the men, and oblige them to keep themselves and everything belonging to them in the greatest cleanliness and order. He must never suffer a man who has any infectious disorder to remain in the company, but send him immediately to the hospital and order place provided for the or other place provided for the recreation of such patients, to prevent the spreading of the infection. And when any man is sick or otherwise unfit for duty or absent, he must see that his arms and accoutrements are properly taken care of, agreeably to the regulation prescribed. He must keep a book in which must be entered the name and description of every non-commissioned officer and soldier of his company, his trade or occupation, the place of his birth and usual residence, where, when, and for what term he enlisted, discharges, furloughs, copies of all returns, and every casualty that happens in the company. He must also keep an account of all arms, accoutrements, ammunition, clothing, necessaries, and camp equipage delivered his company, that, on inspecting it, he may be able to discover any deficiencies. Just getting started. No. Now, I will close with quite a moving letter that Steuben wrote to George Washington. It is dated 29 January 1790, New York. Sir, though sensibly impressed with the marks of confidence and friendship you have been pleased to manifest for me since my arrival in America, nothing but the most urgent necessity could induce me at this time to divert your attention from more important objects of national concern to the consideration of one which may be more of a personal nature. Unaccustomed to such pecuniary distress before I came to this country, the indigent situation to which I find myself reduced becomes every hour more insupportable. 7 years have now been spent in vain solicitation for the determination of a cause, the justice of which was at all times acknowledged by a large and respectable majority of the old Congress. Flattered from session to session with hopes of determination in my favor, I have been induced to prolong my stay in this country until I have encumbered myself with debt and every possible resource exhausted. The immediate decision of Congress on my memorial, presented at their last session, is therefore become indispensable to my existence. And it is to solicit such official assistance as propriety may authorize in this respect that I now take the liberty to address you. The peculiarity of my situation in every respect is submitted as the true reason for making the request. It is indeed peculiar. Whatever the decision may be, I shall at least be relieved from all that anxiety of mind which arises from expectations so long deferred. In whatever quarter of the globe I may be obliged to seek an asylum, the reputation I established in my own country before I left will always ensure me the esteem of every honest man, nor will this sentiment be lessened by the small share I have had in the glorious revolution of the United States. And as I shall have nothing to reproach myself with, I shall be able to support my situation, however reduced, without a blush. With the highest respect, I have the honor to be, Sir, your most obedient and very humble servant, Steuben.